So you want to save the world. Well, how do you go about this? What can be done? This lecture is going to focus in on reducing carbon emissions, which are a major contributor to climate change. But a lot of these ideas are going to help with other environmental problems as well. So let's look at personal choices that can reduce the amount of impact you are having. Some of these obviously are going to be too expensive for the average person, but others will actually save you money. So we'll start with one that is not on this list. Reduce the use of resources. Anything you purchase has an environmental cost associated with it. Do you really need to replace your cell phone every year? Could you continue wearing last winter's clothing for another year? Could you buy used instead of new? You can also do things like use cold water when you wash your clothes and run the dishwasher. Modern soaps clean very well regardless of the temperature that you wash in. Here's a big one. Be as car-free as possible. Public transportation is spotty in the United States. The Boston area actually has some pretty good public transportation. Use it if you can. Or walk or bike to work, which has the added bonus of being good for your health. Drive the most fuel-efficient car you can afford. Do you really need a pickup truck? Do you need a giant SUV? Are you really ferrying your kids' soccer team around, or do you just use that as an excuse to get the SUV, which is a status symbol? Gas-powered lawn equipment, I've mentioned this one before. It uses a lawnmower in an hour, produces as much carbon waste emissions as driving the average car for 11 hours. Oof. So, be satisfied with a less than perfect lawn if you actually get to own a house. Mow less often. Sweep instead of using a leaf blower. And minimize or eliminate your use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Instead of raking leaves up, mow them. Leave them as free fertilizer. Whew, I'm reading this wrong. Leave the lawn clippings on the lawn. If you own your own home, you can also improve heating and cooling efficiency by adding insulation. That's a huge one, especially in the Boston area. Seal cracks around windows and doors. Have your heating system serviced regularly. Now, that may sound expensive, and it is a big out-of-pocket cost, but when I was living in the Boston area and we had our house heating system serviced, our fuel costs went down dramatically. Oil heat. You got to buy oil all the time, and it's expensive. We had our house insulated. In 10 years, even though the price of oil had gone up, our heating expenses dropped to a third of what they were the first winter we were there. If you can, plant shade trees for the summer. On hot days, this doesn't have to be in a house, open windows at both the bottom and the top. This creates air movement in the room, and that really makes you feel cooler. And of course, the biggest thing anybody can do is have one fewer child. Now, again, I know this is controversial because the United States has a history of forcible sterilization for people that are not white, middle class, mentally sound. Mentally sound by who knows whose definition. But it will have a huge impact. It doesn't mean you can't have children. It just means, think about how many you want to have. Now, when we talk about personal actions that reduce carbon dioxide emissions, some of these things work really, really well, and some of them are kind of overrated. So not using plastic bags, well, that's good for a lot of reasons because plastic bags do not recycle, no matter the fact that you put them in the recycling. They usually end up in the landfill and they end up blowing everywhere and they're ugly. But it doesn't really save much in the way of carbon dioxide. Using regional and seasonal food, which is just about impossible in Massachusetts anyway, that doesn't have a big impact. If you cut the amount of meat you eat in half, specifically beef and pork, that has a bigger impact than buying locally produced produce. Flying less, big impact. Modern heating and insulation, big impact. Fuel efficient vehicle and driving in a way that is fuel efficient, by which I mean no slamming on the brakes and slamming on the gas pedal. Good size impact. Going vegetarian, big impact. Just make sure you're getting the protein, the iron, and the B vitamins you need, because they're harder to get with a vegetarian diet. So you got to do a little bit of research there. All right. If you're eating meat, you don't want to go vegetarian, chicken is more environmentally friendly. So when we're trying to think about what kinds of things we can do, we can't do everything. And we can't expect everything to be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good. I think that's just a really important point that is often not understood in our society. So you may have heard people talking about, well, almond milk. Almond trees use so much water, blah, 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 blah. Well, yes, but almond milk is much more environmentally friendly than cow milk. It's not perfect, but it's better than cow milk. Excuse me. And then Gus Speth did a really great quote here. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. A very good point. Science has really good ideas of what the environmental problems are and how to fix them, but we don't have the political and social will to do what needs to be done. So we do have to pick our battles. There are somewhere around 200 countries in the world. Could we get them all to agree to the same set of ideas to help reduce climate change? Or should we go after the top 20 carbon emitting countries, which emit more than 80% of all carbon? Let's try and get those 20 countries to agree. Yeah. It's really a hard thing to do, but it's easier than getting 200 to agree. Can't get the whole United States to agree? How about getting the state of Massachusetts to do something? Or the city of Boston? Or the city that you live in? It's easier to tackle these problems in smaller locations. So we seem to understand the value of oil, timber, minerals, and housing, but we don't appreciate the value of a healthy environment, unspoiled wilderness, solitude, and spiritual renewal. Wow. That's a really good thing to start thinking about. There's also a quote here from David Steen. I think a lot of people who have recently started making environmentally conscious decisions are surprised to realize it just isn't that simple. Being environmentally conscious requires proactively pushing back against systems dependent on unconscious consumption on a vast scale. What is he trying to say here? Well, he's trying to say you can do a lot of things in your personal life to help protect the environment and help reduce climate change. But there's this, the fact is that certain companies produce most of the climate emissions, the carbon emissions, most of the pollution. Oil and gas are huge when it comes to the amount of pollution they produce. And our economy is based on spending. It is based around the idea that people need, that the average person spends and spends and spends and buys more stuff and wants a bigger house and a bigger car and more. And we're constantly being bombarded with advertising that tells us this. And we even get told this by the government. Oh, we're in a recession. Be a true American and go out and buy things. Buying things is not going to be the solution to our environmental problems. The climate I grew up with is gone. This is true for me. I can certainly see the environmental damage and the climate change that has occurred since I was a child. But your climate and your children's climate is still to be determined. We are determining it now. So we need to do what we can to protect the future generations. And the longer we delay, the harder it's going to be to deal with climate change. If we don't do the heavy, big stuff now, the future will have to be unfathomably heroic. It's paraphrasing from Hal Harvey. So, when we talk about environmental change, we shouldn't be developing new, expensive carbon sequestration techniques pulling carbon out of the air if we're not shutting down coal plants. Solar is becoming cheaper. It offers great benefits. So let's spend money on solar. Let's put solar panels on public buildings, on top of covered garages. Let's not focus on the last 5% at the expense of the first 95%. When we're using our limited resources, which our time and our energy, we have to use them wisely. We can't focus on making 7.5 billion people or even 300 million Americans change their lifestyles, but we can target the 250 utility commissions in the US that set standards for their communities, that say the utility companies have to reduce pollution. They can say that. That's who you should be going after. Start at the local level. If you have time and energy, join your city council. If you don't, write them letters. Go out and vote. Fucking vote. The people who vote most frequently are wealthy white people, usually conservative. That's the minority of the population in the United States. So if you can, go out and vote. If you want to have an impact, that's one way. It may feel like you're emptying the ocean with a teaspoon, but it really is important and it really can have a huge impact. Reducing population will help. The economy that we have that is built on growing the population and spending and spending and spending is not sustainable. So one of the things we can do is make sure there's access to family planning and educate girls. Girls who are educated and have access to reproductive technology, birth control pills, IUDs, whatever, is a nice, cheap way of reducing carbon emissions. What is this image? This is a beach in Mumbai. In 2015, a couple of guys got sick and tired of looking at this. This was 5 feet of trash. And these two guys, just a couple of guys, started an organization that removed 11 million tons of waste off the beach. And now, well, in 2018, there were sea turtles coming ashore to nest.